In this lecture video, we're going to discuss strength, argument strength in terms of relevance and grounds, and cogency in terms of the acceptability of the premises. So far, we have looked at strength and cogency in its most basic form. So we said an argument is strong if, assuming the premises are true, the conclusion would probably follow, right? And we said it was cogent if, in fact, all the premises were true. So that's like the basic cookie cutter introductory set of concepts. Now we're just going to chisel away at them a little bit. We're going to refine those concepts and make them more specific. So we're not changing our basic understanding. We are just making them, the understanding, like I said, more refined, a little more sophisticated, and a little more specific. So, in order for an argument, and of course we're speaking about inductive arguments, in order for an argument to be considered strong, logically strong, the premises must be relevant to the conclusion, and they must provide good grounds for accepting the conclusion. Sometimes that's called sufficient reason for accepting the conclusion. And in order for an argument to be considered cogent, it must satisfy the above requirements. In other words, it must pass as a strong or relatively strong argument. And it must have premises that are true and or rationally acceptable. So I'm going to pause on this rationally acceptable condition for a moment. Sometimes arguments have premises that you just simply can't empirically verify or falsify. So moral premises are of this nature, right? Predictive premises are of this nature. Something hasn't happened yet, you can't say that it's true or false. If one of your premises is that X or Y is wrong behavior, you can't empirically verify or falsify that. But you can make a certain determination of acceptability. You can say, that's rationally acceptable, or I don't think that's rationally acceptable. So again, we're expanding our understanding of strength to mean, of course, the conclusion would probably follow from the premises, but we're expanding it to incorporate the concepts of relevance and grounds, just making it more specific. And for cogency, the argument's got to be strong, and the premises have to be true and or rationally acceptable. So let's unpack that even more. An argument is considered strong when the premises are relevant to the conclusion and provide good grounds for it. So by relevant or relevance, what do we mean? Simply put, the premises of an argument are relevant to the conclusion if they offer reasons that actually do support the conclusion, that speak to the conclusion. And also, the conclusion should not take a massive logical leap from the premises. That's also known as a basic non sequitur, or it doesn't follow. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So here's an example of an argument where the premises are indeed relevant to the conclusion. Remember, we're not talking about truth or rational acceptability at this point. We're just examining the logic of the argument, right? Premise one is Smith has appendicitis, he has gout, he has cancer of the bladder. Therefore, Smith should not run the Boston Marathon, right? The question is, are these premises relevant to the conclusion? Indeed, they are, because somebody's health is relevant to whether or not they ought to undertake a 26-mile marathon, right? Now, I'm just going to play with this example for a moment, although there will be a future slide that shows you other examples where the premises aren't relevant to the conclusion. Let's imagine that this said, Smith likes pudding. Smith, or he has a cat, and he there's so many choices. He puts sugar in his burritos. Jeez, this is ridiculous. I mean, imagine if somebody said, the question, what I'm just trying to point out starkly is that if that's what the premises said, you can't draw this conclusion from that stuff, right? Smith likes pudding. He has a cat. He put sugar in his burrito. I mean, even if somebody says, so what follows from these three premises? You'd be like, I don't know. Nothing. They barely even seem related, right? But they certainly aren't relevant to the conclusion. That is just a very obvious example. Another one. Corporations can decrease their taxes by incurring business losses. Therefore, business losses are often an advantage to corporations. Not always, but often. So imagine that if somebody said to you, hey, don't worry that you incurred some losses with your business this year. Business losses are often an advantage to corporations. Well, why? How could that be? Because corporations can decrease their taxes by incurring business losses. Oh, I see. This premise is relevant to that conclusion. Now let's talk for a moment about irrelevance, which we already looked at with the pudding and cat and running the marathon example. But when there is irrelevance, there's no relationship of logical support between the premise or premises or a premise and the conclusion. So the premises or a premise do not provide reasons that support the conclusion. They don't hold it up. So here are some examples of arguments where the premises are just irrelevant to the conclusion. Natural catastrophes are beyond human control. Well, therefore, human beings have no free will concerning their actions. Right? Your head, I mean, when you read an argument like that, take an intuitive clue from yourself. If you're paying close attention to it and your head kind of tilts like your dog does when it doesn't understand something, right? Like, what are you talking about? Imagine if somebody said to you, oh, you know that thing that we toss around, that concept we toss around known as free will, that we can control many of our actions? It's a myth. We don't have free will. And you went, whoa, why would you say that? And they said, well, because natural catastrophes are beyond human control. This just doesn't add up, right? This premise is irrelevant to that conclusion. Another example. The textbooks selected for the philosophy course were hard to read, and the assignments for the philosophy course were difficult, and many students do not enjoy philosophy. Therefore, the instructor of the philosophy course was not competent in his knowledge of philosophy. Now, this, again, is another example of irrelevance. All of these premises are irrelevant to that conclusion. Somebody, imagine, is trying to say, oh, don't take that particular professor because he's incompetent, doesn't know what he's talking about. You said, really? What made you draw that conclusion? Well, the textbooks he picked were really hard to read, and the assignments he gave us were difficult. And also, many students just don't even like philosophy. Do any of those premises support the conclusion that the instructor was incompetent in his knowledge of philosophy? No, they don't. So in both of these cases, then, because the premises are irrelevant to the conclusion here and here, both of these arguments would be considered weak. They're logically weak. Oops. Now let's talk about good grounds, which is the other aspect of logical strength. So for logical strength, the premises have to be relevant to the conclusion, like we just discussed, and they have to, considered together, provide good grounds for accepting the conclusion. So the premises of an argument provide good grounds for the conclusion if, considered together, they provide sufficient reason to make it rational to accept the conclusion. Again, we're not talking about truth or real rational acceptability of the premises yet. We're talking about just the logic part of this argument evaluation. So some arguments may give premises that are relevant to the conclusion, but they just fail to give enough of them. They don't provide good enough grounds. And some arguments may be omitting very obvious facts or evidence that would count against the conclusion. That would be a problem with grounds as well. Do the premises that actually are offered cumulatively outweigh these omissions? So here's some examples of an argument where the premises considered together do provide good or sufficient grounds. Actually, this will be an example of an argument. The goal of cleaning up sports is unattainable. If drugs or performance-enhancing drugs were made legal and freely available, then there would be no more cheating in that regard. Performance enhancement is not against the spirit of sport. It is the spirit of sport. Allowing performance-enhancing drugs would be more fair. And allowing performance-enhancing drugs would be more safe. Therefore, PEDs, or performance-enhancing drugs, should be permitted in sports. So, again, this is an example where you do have good or sufficient grounds. This person is arguing, hey, we should allow performance-enhancing drugs in sports. Lift that ban on them. Well, why? Because we're never going to be able to clean up sports. If we just went ahead and made PEDs legal and freely available, we wouldn't have to worry about testing for cheating and etc. Performance enhancing isn't against the spirit of sport. It actually encompasses the spirit of sport. Allowing them would be more fair, and allowing them would be more safe. So this would be considered decent grounds to justify this conclusion. So you're never going to have a perfect argument. Not every single possible consideration can be offered in favor or against a conclusion. But the question is, Do you have a good collection? Are you spanning enough ground to hold that conclusion up? Almost as if, I'm going to try to make this little drawing here. Imagine that the conclusion is like a tabletop, right? And if you want to hold the tabletop up, in many instances, one leg will do, right? But not always, and it depends on a lot of factors here, like how heavy the tabletop is, what the leg's made of, right? But one leg's okay sometimes, but isn't 3 better? Isn't 4 better in terms of holding up the top, the tabletop, right? In terms of supporting the weight of the conclusion in this instance. I hope that was helpful. So here's an example of an argument where the premises considered together do not provide good or sufficient grounds. When polled, 70% of Calgary tourists say they were given unfriendly treatment at the Calgary Zoo. Took a poll. 70% of the tourists said, man, they were mean to us at the zoo. It was just terrible, unfriendly. Therefore, Calgary is an unfriendly city. This is a problem with grounds, right? So if you were trying to convince people that Calgary is an unfriendly city, fair enough, that anything, you can argue about anything, right? This premise would be relevant to the conclusion, right? If you had a poll that indicated that 70% of tourists said that they were given unfriendly treatment at a tourist place, that would be relevant to that conclusion. But do you have enough grounds to justify that conclusion? This one reason is not enough to justify this conclusion. Again, it's relevant, but you need some more legs to that table, man. This isn't sufficient to justify it. So this argument would be considered weak on the basis of insufficient grounds. Now, we just finished up discussing logical strength. So now we're going to move on to cogency, right? And remember that if you decide that an argument is logically weak, it's automatically uncogent. So this part of the process, cogency, only takes place in its full, full process if you've decided that an argument is relatively strong. If it passes the logic test, then you move on to this more elaborate cogency test. If it doesn't pass the logic test, it's automatically uncogent. You don't have to bother with this part. So an argument's considered cogent when it's both A, strong, like we just discussed, and B, the premises are true and or rationally acceptable. Now I'm going to remind you all again, I basically just said this, but I'm going to remind you of that chart that we had before, right? A strong argument can either be cogent or uncogent, but a weak argument is automatically uncogent. And just as a hint, going forward, once we start examining these bioethical arguments in week 5, they're all going to be relatively strong. You know, it's very unusual that published journal arguments and articles go through the peer review process with problems with logical problems. They're usually caught by peer review, all right? But it's important that we understand this concept as well. So now, again, talking about cogency, let's discuss this notion of rational acceptability of premises. So that means that the premises are either evidently true or it is at least reasonable for those to whom the argument is addressed to believe the premises. It's reasonable. Right? When premises can be considered acceptable. Under what conditions? Well, when they're supported in the argument, right, as like backup support for a premise, justification for a premise, and or they are supported elsewhere, and this is noted like in footnotes, like and endnotes and parenthetical documentation. They are evidently, or what's known as a priori, true, which a priori just means independent of sense data, right? Like they are true by definition, pretty much. Like an example of this would be a triangle has 3 sides. Sometimes claims like that serve as premises and support for a conclusion, but that's what a priori means. Or they're just common knowledge, right? These are reasons or conditions under which premises can be considered acceptable. And when premises can be deemed unacceptable, when they are refutable on the basis of common knowledge or a priori knowledge or reliable knowledge from a testimony or authority, or when they commit a fallacy of cogency. And the fallacies of cogency are these 3: false dichotomy, false cause, and slippery slope. There are others. These are the ones we're going to focus on in the next lecture. So we haven't covered the fallacies yet and how they divide up, but we will. Premises can also be deemed unacceptable when they're not supported by any other evidence. They're just thrown out there as brute fact, and they're not given any kind of other support. They can also be deemed unacceptable when they're vague or ambiguous to such an extent that it's not possible to determine what sort of evidence would establish them as acceptable or unacceptable. Just too vague. So here's some examples of an argument where the premises can be considered rationally acceptable. Water supports a swimmer. In the water, there is minimal stress on problem joints such as knees and ankles. Therefore, swimming is a relatively safe form of exercise for people who have problems with their joints. So if you wanted to convince somebody of this conclusion, right, and you offered these premises, well, water supports a swimmer and minimal stress, right? So if you got to this point, then you can assume that we've already said that this argument is relatively strong, right? But water supports a swimmer, that's pretty much just evidently true. And in the water, there's minimal stress on problem joints such as knees and ankles. That's a perfectly rationally acceptable premise. Therefore, now here's examples of an argument where the premises, may not be, I messed this one up. Sorry about that, everybody. Examples of an argument where the premises may not be considered rationally acceptable. The methods of science and religion are diametrically opposed. And then look, they've got some backup information for this, supporting information for a premise, right? Again, the methods of science and religion are diametrically opposed. Well, really? Because, see, science admits to having no answers, and religion claims to have final answers. Okay. Premise 2. Science has helped to liberate the human spirit. Religion stifles the human spirit, neither with any support. Therefore, a meaningful reconciliation between science and religion is unlikely. All right, let's unpack that for a moment. Somebody's trying to convince you that a meaningful reconciliation between science and religion is unlikely. They're not saying impossible, but unlikely. Well, why do you say that? That's such a pessimistic view. Well, now, first, for a second, imagine that these aren't here. Let's do the whole strength and cogency test from the beginning. All right? We're going to assume that's true. Okay, fine. The methods of science and religion are diametrically opposed. Then we're going to assume that's true. Science has helped to liberate the human spirit, okay? And religion stifles the human spirit, okay? Therefore, I'd say that this is a relatively logically strong argument if you assume these three premises are true. So yes, indeed, you would move on to cogency, right? Now let's take a look. This says, premise 1 says, the methods of science and religion are diametrically opposed, and then offers a little bit of support. Science admits to having no answers, and religion claims to have final answers. Well, this piece of support is just patently false on the face of it. This piece of support is demonstrably false. There are religions who don't claim to have final answers. So you've got a premise that is supported by two false pieces of information. So this is going to render this premise just unacceptable. Unacceptable why? Because it's supported by two pieces of just false information. Furthermore, I mean, you don't need any more to be able to say that this is an uncogent argument. It might be logically strong, excuse me, but it's uncogent for the reasons that we just detailed. Now, but if you wanted to go ahead, you could, because you can still destroy this argument in other ways. Science has helped to liberate the human spirit with no backing information at all. That makes this premise vague. Right? What do you mean by human spirit? What do you mean by liberate? If there had been some decent explanation under here, that's a different story, but there isn't. And same goes for this. Too vague. So this argument, although logically strong or relatively strong, is uncogent and profoundly so. Okay, so that was a refinement of our concepts of strength and cogency.